Understanding the airspace system is easy once you grasp this concept. The designation of a parcel of airspace is driven by what goes on there. In the wide open spaces of the West, airplanes are so few and far between that we don't need many restrictions. On the other hand, we need more control around an airport where airliners are coming and going every 30 seconds. It's important that all pilots be familiar with the airspace designations and requirements for each one. As we go through them, look for the why of each class of airspace. U.S. airspace conforms to the International Civil Aviation Organization system. The International Civil Aviation Organization, commonly called ICAO, classifies airspace by the letters A through G, A being the most restrictive, G having the fewest constraints placed on it. In addition to A through G, there is also special use and other airspace. As we begin discussing airspace, there's one interesting note about these classifications. There's no Class F airspace in the United States. This is because the U.S. has no equivalent to ICAO Class F, where ATC provides separation for IFR aircraft, only so far as practical. Now, let's begin with Class A airspace, which begins at 18,000 feet MSL and extends up to and including flight level 600. Remember, the flight levels are based on pressure altitudes, and pilots operating at and above 18,000 feet MSL must reset their altimeters to the standard pressure setting of 29.92. Flight level altitudes are expressed in hundreds of feet. For example, flight level 350 is a pressure altitude of 35,000 feet. All operations in Class A must be conducted under instrument flight rules, which is another way of saying that you can't fly at and above 18,000 feet MSL, VFR. You must be instrument rated and equipped, obtain an ATC clearance before entering Class A, and maintain two-way radio contact with ATC while operating in Class A. Class A covers all of the lower 48 states and the eastern section of Alaska. Class A airspace is not depicted on charts. The main users of Class A airspace are the airlines, the military, and business aircraft. They all tend to be fast movers, so ATC keeps a good handle on who's doing what up there and provides ample vertical and horizontal separation for all aircraft. Also watched closely is Class B airspace, located around airports where there's a large volume of air traffic. Class B airspace, often compared to an upside-down wedding cake in shape, begins at the surface and extends upward to a designated altitude. Aircraft inside Class B are permitted to maintain 250 knots indicated airspeed, the speed limit for operations below 10,000 feet MSL. However, aircraft operating below the overhanging layers of the Class B airspace are limited to 200 knots indicated airspeed. Before operating in Class B, you must receive authorization from ATC, maintain two-way radio communications with ATC, and have an operating transponder with altitude reporting. Private pilots may operate at all airports within Class B. Student pilots cannot take off, land, or fly solo in that airspace unless they have received ground and flight instruction for the specific Class B airspace. The student's logbook must have been endorsed within the previous 90 days by the instructor who gave the flight instruction. Recreational pilots working toward a private certificate may fly solo in Class B airspace after receiving an endorsement for ATC communication. At the busier Class B areas, such as Chicago and Los Angeles, student pilots may not take off or land at the primary airport. There are a couple of other special cases in these rules. First, an aircraft without a transponder may operate in Class B if the request for the deviation is made to ATC at least 1 hour prior to the proposed operation. Authorization to deviate from the altitude reporting requirement may be given immediately. The minimum VFR visibility in Class B is 3 statute miles, and you must stay clear of clouds. Class B airspace is shown on World Aeronautical, Terminal Area, and Sectional charts. Let's look at Houston as an example. Class B boundaries are shown with heavy blue lines. There are 4 layers in all. Let's begin in the middle and work our way out. The top of the airspace is 10,000 feet MSL, and in the vicinity of George Bush Intercontinental, it extends to the surface. The next layer starts at 2,000 feet MSL. The next layer at 3,000 feet MSL. And the outside layer begins at 4,000 feet MSL. Flying over or under the Class B area, and within 30 nautical miles of the primary airport, the aircraft must have an operating transponder and altitude reporting capability if the aircraft was certified with an engine-driven electrical system. You'll typically see lots of airline traffic in Class B airspace, usually heaviest around pushes, as a carrier lands or departs many of its planes close together. This is a result of the hub and spoke system the airlines use, and it's best to avoid Class B areas altogether around push time. The airlines are also referred to as scheduled carriers, and from these schedules you can know when a push is going to happen, or the tower at the primary airport will usually be happy to tell a pilot when it's best not to show up. Class C airspace surrounds airports handling a moderate volume of air traffic and resembles a 2-layer upside-down wedding cake in shape. To operate in Class C, you'll need to establish communications with ATC and hold at least a student pilot certificate. A transponder with altitude reporting is required within and above Class C airspace. For VFR flight, a minimum visibility of 3 statute miles is required, and you must remain 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet away from clouds. You will find Class C airspace on Terminal Area, Sectional, and World Aeronautical charts. It's depicted by solid magenta circles. This is the Class C area surrounding the Fort Wayne International Airport. The first layer, called the inner circle, begins at the surface and extends to the top at 4,800 feet MSL. The inner circle has a radius of 5 nautical miles. The second layer has a radius of 10 nautical miles and has a base of 2,000 feet MSL. Traffic advisories are provided to all aircraft in Class C. In Class C and Class D, unless otherwise authorized, you may not exceed 200 knots indicated airspeed within 4 nautical miles of the primary airport at or below 2,500 feet AGL. Class D airspace surrounds tower-controlled airports that do not have an associated Class B or C area. Again, you must establish 2-way radio communications with ATC before operating in Class D airspace, and you must possess a minimum of a student certificate. Class D airspace is depicted on VFR charts with a segmented blue line. Many have arrival extensions, giving the airspace the shape of a keyhole. The actual vertical boundary is charted inside a blue segmented box in hundreds of feet MSL. VFR traffic advisories from ATC are provided on a workload permitting basis. Some towers operate part-time, and when the tower is not in operation, Class D airspace reverts to the less restrictive Class E or G. Class E airspace is controlled airspace that is not included in Classes A, B, C, or D, and extends upward from the surface around some non-towered airports, or up from a floor of either 700 or 1,200 feet AGL in most other areas, up to, but not including 18,000 feet MSL. Radio contact is not required to fly VFR in Class E airspace. Cloud clearances in Class E and below 10,000 feet MSL are 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontally from clouds. Below 10,000 feet MSL, 3 miles visibility is required. At and above 10,000 feet MSL and more than 1,200 feet AGL, this increases to 5 miles visibility and cloud clearances of 1,000 feet above and below, and 1 statute mile horizontally. To take off, land, or enter the traffic pattern of an airport in Class E airspace, you must have a minimum ceiling of 1,000 feet and a minimum visibility of 3 statute miles. One exception to this requirement is a special VFR clearance, which must be requested by the pilot. Special VFR allows VFR flight to and from airports in controlled airspace with a minimum visibility of 1 mile and still remaining clear of clouds. At just 90 knots ground speed, 1 mile visibility gives you little more than 30 seconds of forward visibility. Used wisely, special VFR can help you cope with very localized conditions. Resist the temptation to fly special VFR in unfamiliar territory or for more than a few miles. Paraphrasing Mark Twain, cowardice is the surest protection against temptations to risk life and limb. Special VFR at night is even more of a special case. Realizing this, the FAA requires an instrument rating to be cleared for special VFR at night. No special VFR is allowed inside the inner ring of airspace surrounding airports with the notation "No SVFR" above the airport name. In addition, the box around the airport name indicates coverage by FAR Part 93, covering special traffic rules and patterns. Class E airspace is depicted on VFR charts in various ways. Class E airspace having a floor of 700 feet AGL is encompassed within a magenta vignette. The airspace outside of these magenta vignettes is assumed to be Class E airspace with a floor of 1,200 feet AGL. When Class E airspace with a floor of 1,200 feet AGL abuts Class G airspace, it's charted with a blue vignette. This is most common in the western United States. These blue vignettes are framing a federal airway. Class E controlled airspace with a floor of 1,200 feet AGL along the airway and feathered side of the vignette, and uncontrolled Class G airspace on the sharp side of the vignette. Federal airways are designated routes between navigational facilities. This airway is Victor 121, the Victor identifying VORs as the navigational facilities defining the airway. In cases where the floor of Class E is other than 700 or 1,200 feet AGL, but less than 14,500 MSL, it's depicted by jagged blue lines, and the floor is marked in AGL, or in some areas, MSL altitudes, most often near airways or navaids. Some of the Class D airport extensions are also designated full-time Class E airspace. These are depicted by magenta segmented lines. Some non-towered airports are surrounded by Class E airspace that goes all the way to the surface. These are also depicted by a segmented magenta line. Except where charted at a lower altitude, Class E airspace begins at 14,500 feet MSL and extends up to, but not including 18,000 feet MSL over the 48 contiguous states, the District of Columbia, Alaska, and coastal waters, not including the area west of 160 degrees west longitude or airspace less than 1,500 feet AGL. For the really high flyers, Class E begins again above flight level 600 with no upper limit. That brings us to Class G airspace, also referred to as uncontrolled airspace. Hark back to our previous discussion and remember that airports with magenta vignettes have a Class E floor of 700 feet AGL, which is also the ceiling of Class G. You'll find these airports also have an instrument approach procedure. The rules for operating in Class G are fairly simple. You don't have to talk to anybody or get permission to be there. You do need certain visibility and cloud clearances, though, which vary by altitude and whether it's day or night. We'll begin with visibility and start at the ground and work our way up. Below 10,000 feet MSL, visibility must be 1 mile. At night, this goes up to 3 miles. At or above 10,000 feet MSL and more than 1,200 feet AGL, day and night, this increases to 5 miles. Let's do the same thing for cloud clearances. 1,200 feet or less above the ground, you have to stay clear of clouds. Between 1,200 feet AGL and 9,999 feet MSL, you must remain 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontally from clouds. Above 1,200 feet AGL, and at or above 10,000 feet MSL, you must stay 1,000 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 1 statute mile laterally from clouds. An airspace designation not included in the ICAO system is the Terminal Radar Service Area, commonly called a TRSA. TRSAs are depicted on VFR charts with gray rings. There are only a few TRSAs left. As the name implies, Radar Traffic Advisory Service from ATC is available near a terminal in a TRSA. However, whether you get this service or call ATC within the boundaries of the TRSA is up to you. You're very likely to find Class D or E airspace around the primary airport in a TRSA. Keep in mind that pilot adherence to the rules in these areas is not optional. Visibilities and cloud clearances will be those dictated by the class of airspace within which the TRSA is located. Up to this point, our airspace discussions have included weather, aircraft equipment, and pilot qualifications. Now we're going to talk about special use airspace, which establishes limitations on the use of the airspace itself. Special use airspace consists of prohibited, restricted, warning, military operation, alert, and controlled firing areas. All these, except controlled firing areas, are charted on terminal, sectional, and world aeronautical charts. Prohibited areas specifically prohibit aircraft flight, period. The prohibited area P56, for example, is in 2 parts over Washington, D.C. The tabulation of special use airspace on the chart defines the vertical extent of P56 to be up to 18,000 feet. It is in effect continuously. There is no air-to-ground communication, and an additional admonition is given to avoid this area. Restricted areas are defined as airspace where aircraft flight is subject to restrictions. Restricted Area 6612 is in effect to 7,000 feet Monday through Friday between 0800 and 1700 local time. At times other than those, R6612 can be activated with 48 hours notice. Therefore, pilots should check with the Washington Air Route Traffic Control Center whenever they plan to fly through this area. Warning areas are in international airspace. Activities in warning areas may be hazardous to non-participating aircraft. Warning areas cannot be designated restricted areas because they are over international waters. Warning Area W72B on the Washington sectional chart advises flight in the area is hazardous. Military Operation Areas, MOAs, are segments of airspace defined by vertical and lateral limits used to segregate military training activities from aircraft operating under instrument flight rules. Most military training requires abrupt flight maneuvering. In an MOA, military pilots are exempted from FAA regulations prohibiting acrobatics in certain airspace and on federal airways. MOAs identify areas where these activities are conducted. Pilots of VFR aircraft should contact any flight service station within 100 nautical miles of the MOA for real-time information about its current status. Alert areas are depicted on charts to warn pilots of a high volume of pilot training or other unusual aerial activity. All operations in an alert area are conducted according to federal aviation regulations. Pilots of participating and transit aircraft are equally responsible for collision avoidance. Alert Area A632E is established because of student jet training. Controlled firing areas have activities which, if not controlled, would be hazardous to non-participating aircraft. They are not charted because activities are suspended immediately when spotter aircraft, radar, or ground lookout positions indicate an aircraft might be approaching the area. Other airspace includes military training routes and airport advisory areas. An airport advisory area exists within 10 statute miles of an airport which does not have an operating control tower, but does have a flight service station. In this situation, the flight service station provides traffic advisories to arriving and departing aircraft. Communication with the FSS is recommended, but not required. The initials FSS in the airport information block on the chart indicates a flight service station is on the airport. Use of the service is by no means mandatory, but it's always a good idea to use whatever tools you have available to you. Military training routes are mutually developed by the FAA and the Department of Defense. They are generally established below 10,000 feet MSL for operations at speeds above 250 knots. Terminal and sectional charts show MTRs used under VFR as VR, and those flown under instrument flight rules as IR. Those MTRs with segments above 1,500 feet AGL are identified by a 3-digit number. MTRs flown entirely below 1,500 feet are identified by a 4-digit number. Pilots are not prohibited from flying in a military training route. However, pilots should be extremely vigilant when flying on, across, or near MTRs. You can check the status of an MTR by contacting a flight service station within 100 miles of the MTR. Temporary flight restrictions may be imposed to protect persons or property in the air and on the ground from an existing or imminent hazard on the surface. This is to provide a safe environment for disaster relief aircraft and prevent an unsafe congestion of sightseeing and other aircraft in the area. Temporary flight restrictions and limitations are implemented in areas visited or traveled by the President, Vice President, or other public officials. Temporary flight restrictions in the proximity of spaceflight operations provide protection from hazards to pilots and spaceflight crews. Notification of temporary flight restrictions or limitations is made by NOTAMs. We've told you a lot about airspace. There's a lot to remember in preparing for the written and oral portions of the test, but more importantly, this is information you will use just about every time you fly.